All right, here's the video for finding domain and range. So domain is a set of input values, which we know are x values that a relation can have. It is how far left and right the graph can reach. So when finding the domain of a graph, we want to look left and we want to look right and see how far our graph goes. We're going to use what's called interval notation. The number that we write first is how far left our graph goes. And if our graph touches that number, we're going to use a bracket. If it doesn't touch that number, we're going to use a parentheses. Range is a set of output values, which are y values, that a relation can have. It is how far down and up the graph can reach. So again, when we write our range, we write down how low it goes and how high it goes. And again, a parentheses means it will not touch and a bracket means it will touch. So let's take a look at an example. Okay, so here's an example that's not in your notes. So what I suggest doing is drawing a box around your function. This will help you determine how far left your graph goes and how far right. So to determine the domain, we know we look from left to right. So in looking at my graph, the furthest left my graph goes is this point. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a line here at the beginning of my box. And in terms of how far right my graph goes, this is how far right my graph goes. And then for range, we look down and up. So the lowest my graph goes is this point right here. And the highest my graph goes is this point right here. So as we can see here, this box contains my function completely. So when writing our domain, we're going to start with how far left our graph goes. So the furthest left point our graph goes is this line right here. And in terms of where that is on the graph, that's -3. So my lower bound is going to be -3. That's the furthest left it goes. And then we're going to see how far right it goes. Well, the furthest right it goes is this line here. And in terms of where that is on the x-axis, that's at 4. So it's going to go from 3 to 4. So now we need to decide if we're going to be using parentheses or brackets. Well, we know parentheses means it doesn't touch, meaning it does not include that number, and brackets means it does touch. So if we look at our vertical line that cuts off our domain, it does touch our graph at -3, which means we're going to use a bracket. And then if we look at our line that's from our box, it does touch at 4, which means we're going to use a bracket here as well. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for range, but instead for range, we're looking down and up. So the lowest my graph goes is right here, and that's at -1. And for this, we are going to use a bracket because it does hit the graph at -1. It hits it at 2 points. It hits it here and it hits it here. So the lowest it goes is -1, and we're going to use a bracket. The highest my graph goes is right here, and that's 1. And again, we're hitting our graph at 2 points right here and here. So that's going to go to 1. So we'll use a bracket. All right, so here are a couple examples from our notes. So again, we're going to go, for the domain, we're going to go left and right. So the furthest left my graph goes here, and the furthest right my graph goes here. So for domain, the furthest left it goes is -6, and it does hit my graph there at -6, so I'm going to have a bracket. Furthest right it goes is 5, and it does hit my graph at that point right there. So we're going to use a bracket for there as well. For range, we're going to see how low does my graph go. Well, the lowest point of my graph is right here, and that's at -5. And it does hit the graph at -5, so I'm going to have a bracket. And the highest my graph goes, the maximum point is up here, which on my y-axis is 5. And it does hit it at 5, so we're going to use brackets as well. Okay, looking at the second example, the furthest left my graph goes is here, which is at -2. Okay, however, as we can see, there's 2 open circles. Those are called holes, which means that my graph doesn't hit it at -2. It gets really, really close to -2, but doesn't quite hit -2. So in that case, we're going to use a bracket. Okay, and the furthest right my graph goes is right here. It does hit my graph at 2. So we are going to use a bracket for that one. right? And then range, we're going to look how low does my graph go. So this is the lowest, so kind of the same thing. The lowest point it hits is right here. However, since there's an open circle, that means there's a hole, so it doesn't quite hit it. So we're going to use a parentheses at -2. Okay, and the highest my graph goes is here. That's at 2. And just like before, it only hits it at this point, but it doesn't quite hit it because it's a hole. So we're going to use a parentheses there as well. All right, let's take a look at a couple more examples. Okay, so this example on the left. So domain, we're going to go how far left our graph goes, which is going to be at this point. And that's at -2. And since our graph does hit it at -2, we're going to use a bracket. And then for how far right our graph goes, as we can see, our graph continues on forever in this direction, which means that it's going to go on to infinity. So that means my domain is going to go from -2 until infinity. And since infinity is not a number, we're always going to use a parentheses with infinity. Okay, so then for range, we're going to do the same thing. How low does my graph go? So the lowest point is this point, and that's at -1, and it does hit it at -1. And then how far my graph goes up. Well, as we can see that our graph is kind of continuing this arc motion, while it's going forever in this way to the right to infinity, it's also increasing. So that means it's going to go forever up as well to infinity. So that means my graph goes from -1 to infinity. All right, let's do the second one. So for this one, how far left does our graph go? So as we can see in terms of how far left, we have this arrow going up. So not only does that mean it's going forever up, as we can see, it's kind of moving in this direction, which means it's going to forever go left as well. So the furthest left my graph goes is going to be -infinity. Because this is gonna keep going wider and wider and wider as it goes up. So that means my lower bound for my domain is going to be from -infinity. That's the furthest left it goes, and I'm going to use a parentheses with infinity. And then in terms of how far right it goes, this one's a little bit more clear to see. We see our arrow going to the right, which means it goes on to infinity in that direction. So that means my domain is going to go from -infinity to +infinity. For range, as we can see here, we can kind of draw this horizontal line here at the lowest point of my graph. So that's at -3. And as I discussed when we talked about function families, in exponential functions, it looks like it completely flattens out, but really what's happening is it's getting closer and closer and closer to this line at -3, but it's actually never going to touch it. So that means we would have -3 with a parentheses. And then in terms of how far up our graph goes, as we can see, it goes forever up. So that means it's going to go to +infinity. And remember, we always use parentheses with infinity. All right, a couple more examples. So the domain for this one on the left. So this is a quadratic function, and in terms of how far left it goes. So according to our graph, it's here. But as we can see, this parabola or this curve is getting wider and wider as it goes down. So really that means my graph is going to go forever to -infinity. So my lower bound of my domain is going to be from -infinity. And then in terms of how far right my graph goes, it's kind of the same thing. So it's kind of hard to see, but there is a bracket here, or sorry, an arrowhead here, which means my graph is going to forever go down. And as we can see, this is getting wider and wider and wider. So that means my graph is going to go to +infinity. So my domain is going to go from -infinity to +infinity. Essentially, this graph is going to get infinitely wide. For range, the lower bound, so we look at the bottom of our function. Again, these arrowheads going down means that my graph is going to go forever down, which is going to be -infinity. So that's going to be my lower bound. And then my upper bound, for this one, we actually can draw a boundary, right? I know that my graph is not going to go above that line. Okay, the maximum point of my graph is 4, and the graph does hit 4, so we're going to use a bracket there. Okay, and then this last example. Starting with domain, the furthest left my graph goes is here, which is -4. But as we can see, we have a hole, which means we're not going to include the -4. For how far right my graph goes, well, if I go to the right, I see an arrowhead. And that arrowhead is pointing kind of in the upward towards the right direction, which means it's going to keep going forever this way, which tells me in terms of my range, I'm going to go on to infinity. So my domain is from -4 to infinity. For range, we're going to look at my lowest point. So my lowest point is right here, and that's at 1. And it does hit 1 at 2 points, so I'm going to use a bracket. And then how far up my graph goes, again, we look at the highest point of our graph, and if we see an arrowhead kind of pointing in that direction, I know that that means it's going to go on to infinity. So my range is going to be from 1 to infinity. All right, so here are a couple problems from the homework. So starting with number 4. So to figure out my domain, I'm going to go how far left. So the furthest left point I see is right here. So that's from -4. And it does hit the graph here at -4. The only time we're going to say it doesn't hit the graph is if we see a clear hole like we see here. So the furthest right my graph goes is at 3. But as we can see, I have an open circle at 3, which means it's a hole, so it's never going to hit 3 exactly. All right, so for range, we're going to look at our lowest point. So our lowest point is at -5. And just like before, we have an open circle, which means that's a hole, so I'm not going to include -5. And my highest point looks to be 5. Just like before, it only hits 5 right here, and that's an open circle, so I'm going to use a parentheses there as well. All right, number 5, this is a linear absolute value function. So I see a V shape and I see arrowheads. So for domain, since I see an arrowhead kind of pointing in the left up direction, that means my lower bound, this is going to continue on to -infinity. So my lower bound is going to be -infinity. And for my upper bound, we have an arrowhead over here going to the upright. That means it's going to continue going on to infinity as well. So my domain is going to be from -infinity to +infinity. For range, we're going to look at our lowest point. So this is my lowest point right here, and that's at -3. And it does actually hit -3 at my minimum point, so I'm going to have a bracket. And then for how high up my graph goes, since I have 2 arrows pointing in the up direction, I know that my graph's going to go to infinity. So my range is going to be from -3 to infinity.